Well, a very warm welcome to everybody joining us today for our Creation Care webinar. We're just waiting for a few more people to join. And as we do, I should say for those joining this series for the first time, hi, my name is Rob Quayle, joining from Managua in Nicaragua. I'm in the EMI office here. I'm the Manager of Projects and Programs, but my backdrop behind me actually is from Malawi. For those of you who were on the call last week, I mentioned do send through any photos that celebrate creation from your part of the world. So a big thank you to Larry Bentley, long-time EMI volunteer, for sending this photo. A favourite viewpoint from near Zomba in Malawi. Thank you for sending that through. Always amazing how many shades of green the Lord has in his colour palette. If you have a favourite photo from your part of the world that celebrates creation, do please feel free to send that over. This series is about celebrating the wonder of God's creation, but it's also leaning into how, as designers and construction managers, we feel a particular responsibility to care for creation well. Good to see a good number of people in the room now. We'll make a start, and once more, I'd just love to say a very warm welcome to all of you joining from all over the world, whatever time it is for you there. Welcome to the third in our series of Creation Care. For those of you new to EMI, here at EMI, we design and build projects that bring the hope of Christ to communities around the world. And we've been really enjoying this series on creation care, and this session today is looking at creation care in disaster response and disaster risk reduction. And I should say EMI is just one of many Christian organizations that's looking more closely into the area of creation care at the moment. And in fact, the Global Creation Care Forum that took place in South Korea last year released a statement under the leadership of the Lausanne and World Evangelical Alliance Creation Care Network. And one part of that statement that really jumped out to me under the section of global ecological concern said this. It said, "This is a crisis of great injustice as it impacts poorest communities most severely. It also affects most harshly those nations that have done the least to cause the problems, whereas nations whose wealth was built on environmental exploitation can more easily afford to mitigate its impacts." EMI, we're primarily focused in the Global South, and we work with our military partners to ensure that their facilities are better equipped to withstand more extreme climate and natural disasters in general. And an important area where we work is in the area of disaster response and disaster risk reduction. This webinar session is going to explore the intersection of disaster response, disaster risk reduction, and environmental sustainability through the lens of creation care. And presenting today, I am delighted to welcome Sarah Dunn from EMI and Shannon Holding from Medair. Just to introduce our speakers, Sarah is a registered architect and disaster response, disaster risk reduction program coordinator at EMI. She's based in the United States, and she has 25 years of experience in the field and holds a master's degree in international cooperation in sustainable emergency architecture, and has lived and worked variously in Uganda, South Sudan, Ukraine, Turkey, Lebanon, and most recently Myanmar. Shannon is a climate advisor for Medair. Medair is a Swiss Christian humanitarian agency. She's trained as a hydrogeologist with a PhD in climate change and water security. She started with Medair in 2008, and she's worked in several different country programs in the WASH, water sanitation and hygiene sector, and now works remotely for Medair's global support office. So we're very fortunate to have Sarah and Shannon with us today. Welcome, guys. If it's okay, I'm just going to pray for us as we make a start. Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us together from all over the world today. Lord, we thank you and we praise you for the wonder of your creation. Help us as we think how we can better steward, cultivate, and care for it. Lord, I pray your blessing on Shannon and Sarah now as they bring this important topic to us. In Jesus' name, amen. I should just add that there will be a chance for questions at the end, and do please put your questions in the chat. You can do that at any point during the talk, but we will pick those up at the end. So do please send those through. We look forward to answering them. And so over to Shannon. I think you're going to be talking first.
Great, thanks, Rob. So yeah, I'll just give a little bit of a background on Medair and our approach to climate and environmental considerations before handing over for Sarah to share a bit more details about one example. So as background, we are a Swiss NGO started in 1989, which means for the last 35 years, Medair has been providing life-saving humanitarian assistance for people affected by conflict, disease, and disasters so that the world's most vulnerable and hard-to-reach people can live with dignity and hope. That's our mandate. Next slide. This map shows where we are currently working. The countries in red are our current areas of operation, and those in yellow are where we have responded previously. So we tend to work in places that have acute crisis and then move on or hand over to other longer term actors once that acute crisis is over. Some of these countries, that means we've been there for decades, and others, it's a shorter term response. Next slide. What I wanted to highlight here was that 7 out of the 10 countries that Medair operates in currently have the highest humanitarian risk levels according to the Inform Risk Index. So when we talk about disasters, that is something we're fairly familiar with. We also have a global emergency response team that will be on the ground within 72 hours of any acute rapid onset crisis. But really, this is what we deal with as disasters. Next slide. So when we look at climate and environmental considerations particularly, Medair approaches these through 2 aspects of our identity. One is our humanitarian mandate of saving lives. Rob already touched on this, but really there are widespread impacts on humanitarian needs from climate, and really it disproportionately impacts very vulnerable people, most of all. So this is a key part of our approach and response. We also approach this from our faith expression to care for others, and an outworking of that care is in ensuring people are equipped to face the future that they have. We do this with hope for that future. And I think often when we talk about certainly climate considerations, it can be discouraging, I think. But we really choose to be motivated by hope, and we can do that with God's help. And we really do see this as an excellent opportunity to respond. So in terms of, next slide actually here, in terms of talking about, let's say, climate environmental considerations, and here I've written climate crisis, and how that interacts with humanitarian response, there's 2 aspects. So first, in the blue, humanitarian response impacts climate and environment. So there is an impact to the climate from our work or of our work. And then there is also an impact from the climate on our work, so driving those humanitarian needs, and also how our humanitarian response then further impacts the environment. Broadly speaking, it can categorize the actions around the impact of our humanitarian response as mitigation, and the actions of reducing the impacts of climate as adaptation. So I'll be looking at or sharing some examples of each of those. So in the next few slides, I'll be looking first at what is Medair doing to mitigate the impacts of our response on climate and environment. Next slide. So one of these is using an environmental screening tool, which is specific to humanitarian projects. That's NEAT Plus. Some of you may be familiar with this. They have shelter, wash, and food security modules where you enter in specifics around your project context and your specific project activities. Yeah, next slide is all right. Thanks, Sarah. So here is just an example. It's hard to read, but what you can get the picture of is that you're going to put in a lot of different information around the building density, population history, the geographic conditions, and then as an output, you get, let's say, this traffic light of issues of high, medium, or lower concern. And then in that next slide, this one, yeah, we can stop here for a bit. This one, if you have any specific activity here, I've just drawn out an example for water distribution networks, but if you're doing any other sort of activity, you then have an outline of key environmental concerns and the potential impact of those, as well as mitigation tips. So it's quite a useful tool to really characterize and gather together the sort of environmental actions that you might want to be taking or want to be aware of. So it's a really great way to identify what might be some key considerations. So going into the next slide. Those are then fed into what is our local environmental management plans, and these are at a project-based level. So every major location that we work in owns one of these plans, and some of that feeds into the specific project activities that we might have identified in the NEAT Plus. We also use Green Office tool to look at our particular activities. Do you mind back to this one? Yeah, we can pause here. And that really, highlights our environmental issues, mitigation measures, or action plans that we have. So it's a great resource and a tracker for progress where we can say, this is what we want to change, this is how we want to improve. And those are one of our key ones. And then the last on mitigation, we can go to the next slide. So the last one I wanted to highlight was also looking at our greenhouse gas emissions. So as an organization, we've used the Humanitarian Carbon Calculator tool, HCC+, and really looked at a snapshot of what our greenhouse gas emissions as an organization is, including sort of all of our fuel, electricity purchases, travel, all the purchased goods and transportation. And this then informs our roadmap for looking at how we can reduce the emissions that we produce as part of our operations. Next slide. So going back to this, that sort of covers just some key highlights around what are we doing to mitigate the impact of our humanitarian response. But a lot of our work really is looking, how can we help the communities that we're trying to reach adapt and build their resilience to the impacts that they're going to feel from climate environment. So I'll look at a few of those examples here. Next slide. So when we talk about disasters in Medair's frame, and I'm sure many others, we have our rapid onset disasters like an earthquake, floods, storms. We also have our slow onset disasters. Next slide. Which may be, let's say, drought or famine. And we really are looking at both of those in our program. So one of the key ways that we try to improve or equip our the places that we're working in our interventions is, next slide, through country-specific climate summaries. And these are really applying DRR approaches to look at climate risks specifically so that we can understand what the expected humanitarian impacts of those risks are and what are some key adaptations that we can do to reduce the impact of the risks on people that we're trying to reach. Next slide. So let's say here, this is an example from one country where we've seen our key climate risks by looking at the literature out there and understanding what's happening are extreme temperatures, higher mean annual temperatures, flooding, and drought. And based on those risks, we can map out what our likely humanitarian impacts are. In this case, heat-related morbidity and mortality, disease outbreaks, injury, asset loss, food insecurity, water scarcity, and prolonged displacement. From here, then we look at a sort of a menu of adaptations. And then we map these adaptations, which are worked out in more specific detail in other documentation, really map those out by sector. So we have our health and nutrition related adaptations, those related to WASH, shelters infrastructure, and our cash programming. And some of these obviously relate to more than one impact and others would be just for one. These are really mapped out in a lookup tables so that it also helps our projects as they design programs to understand the interconnectedness and what other risks and what other activities they might be able to complement our interventions with. Next slide. So some examples of our climate adaptive response might be early warning systems or making use of existing early warning systems and making sure that we connect what's available with community information and making sure that that's available at a community level, because sometimes those are available maybe to other actors or at a national or regional level, but not into the specific community. And then we also work on various aspects of preparedness that might be vaccination campaigns, community awareness, so helping people to be prepared with preventative actions that can protect their health ahead of an impact, prepositioning supplies for seasonal access restrictions. We also do a lot of work around community DRR training, and that has a lot of benefit even just in building awareness around what those risks, impacts, and adaptations are so that people are equipped to be able to do that. Sometimes we also then complement that with construction of features like check dams. We also look at various forms of anticipatory assistance, but that's really one of the ways that we approach that. And Wanted to give a little background on Medair and our view on climate environmental considerations before handing over now to Sarah to share a bit more of a specific example.
Thanks, Shannon. This is going to be a case study on an innovation project that included Medair's South Sudan program. I participated in this early on, and then as EMI, we joined in the final 2 phases of the project. So we'll just go through the project and give this example. This was really a partnership that was based on a grant from Tech for Dev. It was a few years in the making, and yes, completed in 2023. The objectives were to make sure that we were supporting communities and the resilience they needed to adapt to these climate impacts that were happening and the increased flooding they were experiencing. Also, we wanted to make sure that it was sustainable, so identifying long-lasting, locally available materials that could improve the system that's been in place for years as different organizations have been addressing shelter needs for communities there. Also wanted to localize this project through collaboration of several different local actors. And these project partners, Medair, EPFL was the Tech for Dev partner through their structural exploration lab. And we also collaborated with the University of Juba's School of Architecture. So all of those partners worked together to come up with this innovation project. The context in South Sudan, there's around 2.6 million people that have been displaced just in 2020, 2022, which was when this project first started, as a result of both conflict and violence and also flooding. There were heavy rains in 2024, just recently, that just continues this process of flooding that happens around the country. The typical flood cycle for shelter responses in South Sudan happens for abnormal flooding. They're used to flooding over the years, but it's increased to the extent that they're not able to recover like they used to between floods. You can kind of see the cycle here. You have rainy season, you have flooding that happens, you have people who are displaced because of the flooding, and organizations will come in and give an emergency shelter kit. That's leading to temporary settlements that they're using until the flood subsides, and then they return to their damaged homes. And another distribution usually happens to help them reconstruct. And then, of course, this cycle continues. The typical kit contents that are handed out are tarpaulins, rubber rope, mosquito nets, and other non-food items. And then they're handed out. Some of them are repeated in the second distribution, tarpaulins, bamboo bundles to rebuild, rubber rope, mosquito nets, and non-food items again. So as you can see, having to continually provide emergency shelter kits and kits for reconstruction use up a lot of resources. The phase 1 for this project was research, just looking at what types of flood resilient shelters are around the world, and also doing an inventory of what building resources and shelter practices are available in South Sudan. This was a combination of really University of Juba students doing a lot of the local shelter practices and building resources, since there's not a lot of published information on that. And then EPFL students and faculty doing more of the what is available around the world and what other contexts used when they face many floods. One of the things that we landed on to be able to use, which is also in one of the shelter kits, so it's not introducing something brand new, is bamboo. There's not a lot of things published about bamboo in South Sudan, but one of the faculty at the University of Juba has been studying bamboo for many years, and said there were 11 indigenous species there. We can see a few facts about bamboo. It's native to all continents. It can grow very tall. It matures in 3 to 5 years. The tensile strength is up to 28,000 psi. But there are things that need to be done for it to last well in buildings. So it needs to be dried and treated for termites. The processing requires about 1/3 of the energy of wood. And it meets 7 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We won't go into those now, but you can do some research later on that. The other material that we wanted to use was taking this existing rubber rope you can see in the picture to the left that's handed out in both of the kits that I mentioned, and create kind of a new way to use it in the South Sudan context. This was already a technology that they were using in Sudan to the north that creates a little bit stronger material by braiding or twisting the rubber rope into longer strands. We also used recycled rubber tire in a different way for this kit, which we'll explain a little bit further, but you can see that below the braided rubber rope here in the photo to the right. The second phase was the design phase and a prototype they built in Switzerland at EPFL. We wanted to kind of address both the emergency shelter phase by giving them a kit that would be able to be used and then reassembled when they return as a roof construction for their tukul, their homes that they normally build. You can see on the right some of the prototype mock-ups of how to use the bamboo to make a frame for these 2 different types, the shelter and the roof reconstruction. And you can see that, it's all tied together with the rubber rope. The recycled rubber tires are used at the top. And with a compression disc that will help the roof construction just stabilize itself without having, more than just a bolt and some wooden discs. So you can see this kit of parts was created, bamboo poles, different lengths, rubber rope and different lengths, and those rubber straps cut from the tire, compression disc, and the bolt. The tarpaulin that's also standard for the shelter kit is still being introduced here. It's something they are used to using. It is something that they can get quickly while they're waiting for the grasses to grow to be able to thatch over that for the roof reconstruction later. You can see behind this page, the design also included research on how to tie the rubber rope to create knots that were nice and stable. But, as always in our design, we want to test this out on ourselves and in conditions before we actually use this in a real distribution. So that is what we ended up doing. Here are some other pages just showing the diagrams because that was also part of the design process. What kind of information do we need to be able to use to convey to people rebuilding on their own so that, the training, the time it takes to get these distributed is quicker and faster. So you can kind of see this is kind of an IKEA type kit of parts that you have to go along with the actual materials. So phase 3 was in South Sudan, and this is where EMI stepped in as a partner. We wanted to prototype this, go through the instructions with The students that you see there, this was basically understanding, one, does the design work in the context? Two, how do we best communicate how to build and construct these to the local population? And three, what other design tweaks or changes do we need to make as we go into the actual distribution phase? Here are some close-up shots of some of the students constructing. We also wanted to time how long it took to construct to know how many of these we could distribute, how long it would take, and just, understand the things that we weren't able to think about in early design stages that were important to know, especially the logistics of getting all the materials to one place, things like that. We were trying to document everything that we could in this prototype phase so that we could make the distribution phase smoother. So phase 4 was really production, training, and distribution. So we did make changes based on prototype feedback. We were able to employ local women to braid the rubber ropes, created jobs for them that they didn't have before, and have told us they were going to continue doing after this project. Just they found that the braided rubber rope was useful in lots of different contexts. Other shelter cluster partners joined us for a training. So we trained others how to do this and gave them the instructions so that they could create their own kits and use this in their own distributions as well. Then we also trained trainers. So we took 5 team leaders from the local community. We were going to do the distribution and trained them how to do it. And they in turn trained others in their community. And we distributed these to 50 families in South Sudan as kind of a test for how this went. The final kit cost ended up being $290 each. You can kind of see photos here of the emergency shelter going up. And yeah, we'll probably answer some questions after about, how this worked and what they thought about it. But you can see that it just creates kind of the basic shelter for an emergency. It's not intended to be long-term. It provides opportunities for them to create a space inside it, how they want, add additional things to it. The roof reconstruction is really dependent on them coming back to poles maybe destroyed by the flood laying on the ground. They're able to reconstruct the poles that they normally use and use this same kit of parts to create the roof structure, use that same tarpaulin system until the thatch is able to be completed once the grasses grow tall enough for them to really rebuild the way that they're traditionally used to building. So some of the environmental impacts that we were able to calculate after the fact, and as we were looking back on this project as a whole, we estimated that traditional shelters produce about 0.5 to 1.5 kilograms of waste per person per day. So reusable materials reduce that by 20%. The 600 recycled tires that would be reused for 300 shelter kits is part of, this impact as well. So we also want to think through like the use of bamboo, making sure that some of the shelter kits or reconstruction kits use just traditional timber. So by using bamboo, it limits that deforestation for the shelter materials. One important note about the tire manufacturing, it emits 67.48 kilograms of CO2. And each flood resilient shelter uses about 11.36 kilograms of rubber. So we have some emission savings per shelter by reusing those tires of about 0.77 tons of CO2. And you can see those references at the bottom. The other thing we were thinking about is just the cost to transport. When floods happen, the roads are shut down in South Sudan, so there's a lot of flying materials into different places. We were estimating the CO2 to fly one kit is about 30 kilograms from Juba to Rumbek, which is one of the cities, that experiences this. As an example, the shelter kit weight is 83 kilograms, so distributing 300 kits one time instead of two saves about 3 tons of CO2. There's also, petroleum savings per kit for the reused tires. You can see those numbers there, but we estimated 300 kits is about 15,900 liters of petroleum saved. So this is just another, ending slide showing those two. Of course, the roof reconstruction on the left, the poles supporting it are not the normal height of the Tukul shelters that are there, but you can kind of see the scale and how big of a space that it creates for people. And I will hand it back over to Rob.
Thank you, Sarah and Shannon, for sharing that. That's really interesting. Both just that sort of methodical approach to projects, thinking about the NEAT plus assessment. I heard of that, but I've not seen the details on that. Understanding the difference between rapid response disasters or rapid onset disasters, and slow onset disasters. And then this very sort of practical example, Sarah, of the shelters in Sudan and the savings there that you showed. I've got quite a few different questions, and maybe while we're waiting for anybody to post, I can kick us off. But just a reminder, guys, if you would like to put a question to Shannon and Sarah, do please post that in the chat. One, Shannon, just on that point of the different types of disasters, the rapid onset and the slow onset, are there any studies or anything that's showing that these are increasing in number and frequency over the last 20, 30 years? And if so, is there any proportion that it's more on the slow onset, the famines, etc., or the rapid onsets, the storms, or is it hard to really deduce much pattern?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think, in one thing to be aware of as well is they tend to overlap. So you usually have an underpinning of, let's say, a slow onset disaster who's, is ongoing for over many years with spikes of particular flood seasons or storms or other things like that. So often it's a layered occurrence. And we do look at part of our country-specific climate adaptation resources is making sure that we have looked at each specific context and ideally as regionally specific as we can, so subnational. There is, we would rely on, I would say, the well-regarded established publications around climate projections, whether those come from, massive climate models or even down to the local hydrometeorological more short time frame projections that we have. But yes, generally speaking, we are seeing pretty reliable high certainty projections around more of the slow onset. So drought and water reduction tends to be happening just because of the mean annual temperature increases, and that has, knock on in various ways on the hydrologic systems as well as just the climate. And I would say the storm frequency and precipitation is notoriously quite difficult to model and more unreliable. So you're going to see lower certainty of what exactly is going to be happening in one area or the other. But generally speaking, people would still come around to the same conclusion of increased intensity. So when those do occur, maybe frequency may not be increasing, but that intensity will be increasing. So I think if that sort of answers your question, we do look at a very specific country level, and try to map that out, season by season, what we're looking at. But I'd say the big picture is always that they're overlapping, and really needing
Yeah.
to see what the specific resilience, and as Sarah has showed, what are people already recovering from as they head into this new crisis, I think is quite an important context to keep in mind.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. And Sarah, I don't know if I have completely caught, but that cycle of the flooding there in South Sudan and the recovering, it's an annual cycle. What was the particular reason why they are finding it harder to cope with building back quicker and needing more support? Are they becoming, is it more severe, the flooding they're experiencing, or there are other multiple challenges that are affecting their resilience and the ability to respond?
Yes, I would say most of the organizations that were doing the shelter responses before, don't hold me to this, but I think like 2019 was probably a turning point where they started responding to these abnormal flooding conditions because populations weren't having time to recover between the floods. So usually they would have a longer season of dry where they could actually, recover on a seasonal basis. And the flooding was more intense and it wasn't drying out fast enough for them to recover before the next rainy season came. So that around that time frame is when organizations started responding more to flooding versus just the traditional, conflict and violence type responses that they were doing before.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. We've got a couple of questions in here. One from Graham. Why is it important to consider climate issues when responding to disasters? Shouldn't we simply do whatever is needed in response to disasters, or does that lead to more disaster? Who wants to have a go at responding to that?
Yeah, good question, Graham. I think, typically we think of humanitarian response, and so response meaning you wait for, you see what the needs are and you address those needs. And I think increasingly what we do see though is that climate is driving those needs so much more so that when you do, let's say, respond to those immediate needs, you have the risk of, what's considered maladaptation. So helping people in a way that puts them at further future risks. So let's say if you help people fully rebuild on a floodplain, but not addressing the future flood risks, you can be, further either increasing their risks or just deepening those. So I think that's definitely one aspect of why we want to look at climate issues, even in a sort of disaster response. But the other is also just the world has more limited resources towards this. And so we are always working in a more resource constricted, resource scarce environment. And so when you want to make the most of of what you can do in response, then you would have better efficiency by helping people before before the disaster strikes, basically, or helping them earlier in the disaster. So being able to predict or look at what's happening and be able to put in some preventative measures ahead of time can make the humanitarian impacts less severe and more cost effective in the long run, basically. So some of that is just to make sure that, we don't blindly wait for it, because I think there's a decent amount of information that we have around what's likely to start driving some of these disasters. Same way we apply sort of security monitoring to look at conflict-related impacts, we can do the same on the climate side.
Yeah, but basically being prepared and mitigation is more effective than response, if it can be.
Yeah,
Sarah,
we do
did you have
both,
anything?
but
Yes, sorry. Sarah, did you want to add anything to that, or should we jump on to the next one?
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Thank you to Cynthia, engineering, civil engineer graduate from Uganda. I would like to know the challenges you faced during the implementation of the emergency shelters, structural resilience. Sarah.
I would say one of the main challenges that we found was more logistical. Like finding bamboo that they've harvested at the right lengths that we specified, and they were dry enough to use, and not too dry that, they were dried properly and not too brittle, the right diameter. So I think that was the biggest challenge we found when we did the prototype with the University of Juba students. Yeah, we made some changes. We also decided that the time it took to cut things to the right length was something that, yeah, we had underestimated, because they didn't come perfect bamboo, straight in cuts. We had to spend a little more time making those ready for the kids than we expected.
Thanks. Yeah, I love those IKEA style construction sort of manuals that they look like it made it quite straightforward. You said the slide showed of the tarpaulin being pulled into place, you could share a little bit more about how the people responded to them or how they found them as shelters and practical, and whether or not they felt bamboo was in any way inferior or even better than materials that they'd used previously, or the rubber rope. Did you have any feedback on that?
Sure. We were only able to, distribute to 50 families. So obviously a scaled up version would probably give us more varied results and more feedback from even more perspectives. But what we found was the emergency shelter one, because the front and the ends were open, it was intended for them to kind of fill it in different, if they wanted to divide it into 2 rooms or 1 room. They really preferred to have some additional materials in the kit to do that for them instead of, using things found locally. So that was part of the feedback we got for that one. I think everything else seemed, pretty straightforward. Obviously, when they use the kit to construct the roof version, they need their own poles to be able to do that. So when we were doing the second kind of distribution and monitoring how that went, there were more people that didn't have poles than did have poles. So there were a lot more of the emergency versions they chose to construct versus the roof. So that's another thing that would have to be considered depending on the context is, whether those poles to actually build the walls are available or not.
Great, thank you. Okay, another one here from John. Going back to the floods. Do the floods always occur in given areas, or are they spread out in different areas? Are there any mitigation measures or flood warning systems that can be thought about?
I might be able to add on this one maybe briefly. And part of it is that Sarah touched on that a little bit. It's that these floods are becoming more abnormal, so unprecedented. So although people had some awareness of where the usual magnitude of flooding would extend to, it's been, more massive, some more widespread, deeper water, inundation lasting longer. Everything is harder to manage. So it's very widespread. South Sudan is very low, especially in the flooding areas, very flat topography. So it's more about the massive scale of that, which I think is creating this beyond normal coping measures. So there are some warning systems, but it's not localized. And so in that sense, you're talking about, county level sort of responses. Difficult to help people to know not everyone. I mean, there were massive displacements a few years ago, millions, which creates its own sort of crisis. Whereas most would try to shelter in place.
Yeah. Thanks, Shannon. Back to the shelters. Do people pay in part for the kits? There's a question about $270, or was it $290 per kit? Seems quite expensive. How is that funded for the families who use them?
So they aren't paying for the kits. This was just to give the cost for the organizations, and it was all funded through the Tech for Dev grant. For this to really scale up, organizations would need grant funding, private funding, some type of funding to be able to provide these for people. But as I mentioned, before, like there were some expectations with the design that they could provide, like internal walls or things like that for themselves, find materials for them to have, kind of their own input on the design, the poles that are needed for the walls. So the overall cost was covered by the organizations distributing, not the impacted population.
Not the families using them. Thank you.
Mhm.
And then Brian in Uganda is wondering if the design for the shelters would apply outside of Sudan, Uganda, or anywhere else globally.
Well, actually, the Medair is trying to implement this in their Madagascar program as well. So they're looking into how that needs to adapt to be able to use it in a context that also has a lot of cyclones, so extra wind on these shelters. So it would require a little additional research to make sure that they could stand up in those type of conditions. But yes, I think, if there were funding available to kind of scale up, research this in other contexts, I think it could be applicable other places.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Jim wants to know what termite treatment was used for the bamboo, if any, is it readily available, any environmental impact?
So for this kit, we use the standard bamboo that they use for other responses. So it was not treated, but it should be treated. Locally, people would normally use burnt engine oil for that. There's also a solution you can soak the bamboo in. Some other countries that use it more extensively soak bamboo. I'm trying to remember. I can add this in follow-up email. But yes, there's a solution you can soak it in that will help that.
Good question, Jim. Thank you. You guys are doing great here. Lots of questions. We'll go with two more, shall we? And then call it there. Tony has asked, Shannon, you mentioned the difficulty sourcing appropriate, suitable raw materials. Does the model extend to stocking, storing materials for resilience, or is bamboo too degradable for long-term storage? I mean, that could be to either of you, actually. But does the model, I guess, referring to the pilot scheme model, does it extend for stocking, storing material for resilience, or is bamboo too degradable for long-term storage? That might actually be one for you, Sarah.
I think, we were storing it, for a month at a time. I don't know that I have the research knowledge to know exactly how long you can store it. I think it would depend on your storage conditions as well, the climate, and just like any other timber product, how long you can store it is very dependent on, the context. So we were barely getting the bamboo in time to do the actual distribution. So we were not storing it that long to understand like the long-term implications of storing it. But yes, that would be something to study scaling up.
I think also in many other contexts, including in South Sudan and other sort of sectoral responses, we do struggle with being able to get the right supplies at the right time. And so things like a core pipeline where we have joint procurement, where you can have one sort of set of warehousing, does help that. And they would include sometimes bamboo materials in that so that you have that on hand. But in terms of, studies on how long, what's the shelf life of that, I don't think there is necessary information on that.
Yeah. Thank you. Final one. Bamboo's really caught the interest here, and we could do a whole talk on bamboo because there's some stuff in the Cambodia office where they're looking at these. But actually, I think you might have answered this already. Do you cut the bamboo to the right measurements before distribution? It sounded like that was actually something that would cause more time than was expected. Does the kit come with a manual? Yeah, I think we saw some of those step-by-step instructions. What have they used in the past for such emergencies?
Yeah, so when we did the final distribution, we made sure they were cut to the right length. Another complication with this process is handing out tools that could be used in, dangerous ways weren't allowed. So making sure that we had things cut properly so we didn't have to hand out knives and saws and things like that was part of the design process. Yes, we did distribute the step-by-step instructions to the trainers that we trained. But we also printed out huge banners with all of the instructions on them so they could hang it up in the community. The community would understand what to expect, what it should look like at the end, what the steps were. And as they were training more people, they had the information right there in a visual format to be able to do that themselves. And in the past, yes, it was just small kits. Like I said, there were 2 different types of kits that they used that included basically just tarpaulins. The reconstruction kit included some bamboo, but the initial emergency shelter kit did not. And then the rubber rope as well. And those other items that I listed were part of past emergencies.
Great. Well, thank you. We could probably go on for ages, but we'll probably draw a line there. And thanks for the questions. If there are any we haven't answered, we'll take a quick look and we'll try and get back to you. But thank you so much, Sarah and Shannon, for sharing with us today. It was really interesting. And thank you, everybody who's joined us. Just a reminder, we have got 2 more in our webinar series on creation care. The next one's coming up in October. We'll be looking at landscape architecture, creation care in landscape architecture, looking at things including biodiversity. We don't have an exact date for that in October, so keep an eye out for that. An email will be going around for those of you who signed up previously. So coming up in October. And then also, again, if you weren't there at the beginning, just to say, if you have a favorite photo from your region that captures something of the wonder of creation that you'd like to share to appear on the back of the next creation care talk, please send that through to anybody you've got an email address from in the global communications marketing group, or to me personally at rob.quayle@emiworld.org. So thanks once again, everybody, for joining. Thanks to Sarah and to Shannon in particular, and look forward to seeing you guys next time. God bless.